prayer.
Okay.
God of power, of healing and wholeness, open our hearts that we may be open to new insights into the wielding of earthly power in your name, both by us and by your church. Amen. Well, Jenny, I think, is the fourth person to challenge us with contentious Christianity. And her topic, the church and power, she seems eminently suited to talking about. Because as you may already have read, she works for Chester Diocese as Director of Studies for Pastoral Workers and is also an Associate Vicar of Timperley Parish and has a listening ministry as a spiritual companion. But even more important for this evening, she has research interests in exploring issues of power, leadership and collaboration within ministry teams, and indeed is doing a doctorate in it. As she says, the topic of church and power is a very large one. And maybe we'll only scratch the surface, or maybe we'll have so many thoughts and ideas that actually you'll have enough for your doctorate. Jenny is especially keen for us to explore what power the church has, what does it look like, and how is it wielded? And how has this power been abused? And how might it be used for good? So that's a challenge in itself. So I'd like to hand over to Jenny and let her speak for herself and be contentious. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Chris. As I begin, I'm going to put my slides into the chat, if that's okay, and then you can just go home if you want to. You've got everything on those slides, but I've put them there just as we're going through. If I move too quickly through them, you've got them for reference. And if you want to start thinking about questions for conversation, then you can be doing that while I'm speaking. So you can move at your own pace somewhat. And I'm just going to share my screen before I start, so I'm not distracted by trying to do that in a moment. There we go. And my final task is to make sure I can see all of you as well. There we go. So thank you for that introduction, Chris. For several years, I've worked with clergy and lay people who are training for ministry and in formation and discernment, both as they set out in ministry and then in ongoing training and development. And in the course of this work, I quite frequently run into questions about power and leadership. So as Chris says, from September, I'm going to be building on that experience with a doctorate. And my working title is Cast Down the Mighty, Followership and Co-Creation in Ministry in the Church of England. I'll come back to that. I'm not an expert because this topic is far too big for anybody to be an expert in. So this talk is part of a much bigger conversation. And that's a conversation that's been happening quietly and loudly for a long time. And it's a conversation that I want to invite you to be a part of. As Chris says, you could just write my doctorate for me this evening, save me 7 years of hard work. But I don't want you to think of the question time as you asking questions of an expert, but more of a dialogue where we can share our experience and our wisdom together. So I've split what I'm going to say into 3 sections. What power does the church have? How has the church abused its power? And then how might the church use power for good? And as we begin, I want to draw your attention to the artwork, which is on each slide. And this is the Supper at Emmaus by Kerry Richards from the Methodist Modern Art Collection. And I use this picture quite often when I'm talking about leadership or power, because it captures something about what a healthy power dynamic in ministry might look like. So what do we imagine when we talk about the church's power? What does it mean for the church to be powerful? And what even do we mean by the word power? Stephen Sykes published a short introduction to power and theology about 15 years ago. And in many ways, his work feels quite dated now, and he lacks a contextualization to it. But he does offer some helpful ideas about the power of the church. Sykes draws on the work of Stephen Luke's, who says, to have power is to be able to make a difference in the world. So Luke's takes us away from precise definitions about power towards a question. This question might help us work out what we mean when we talk about power. So he asks, what interests us when we're talking about power? So bringing these two things together, this idea of power as an ability to make a difference, and this question about what it is that interests us about power, might draw us above preconceived ideas about power. And this shift in perspective is really important. I'm just going to shut my window because somebody's firing up a petrol engine. This shift in perspective is really important, because if we throw around language about power carelessly, if we pin power down to negative or unthought through definitions, then we're in danger of talking about power and its abuses without stopping to do the inner work of reflexivity. So how does it affect me? So we might project our ideas about power and its abuse as something that other people are guilty of, but not ourselves. Or we talk about institutional power without growing in awareness of the part that we play in the institution. And so I don't think we can talk about power for long before we come to the painful question: in what ways have I been, or in what ways am I, complicit in the misuse and abuse of power? Power is not just out there, wielded by somebody else. If we take Luke's definition, then we all have the power to make a difference. How do we do that in ways that we may not even be aware of? So this is a conversation that starts within us as well as beyond us. I'm also aware that many, if not most of us, will bring experiences of hurt from the ways in which others have abused their power to harm us. And so as well as the reflexivity that owns our own complicity, we need to be aware of the pain that we carry within. So this is my little disclaimer. If there are things arising this evening that you feel you haven't dealt with or processed, then you may like to contact the Diocesan Counselling Service, and details are on the Diocesan website. And if you feel you need to take the more serious step of making a safeguarding disclosure, then you can contact your parish safeguarding officer. Their details will be on your parish website very prominently. Or if all else fails, contact the Diocesan safeguarding officer, and her details are on the Diocesan website. So we've started with quite a soft definition of power, the ability to make a difference in the world. And we've recognised our own complicity in the abuse of power and the ways in which we may have been hurt by the abuse of power wielded by others. So what then about the power of the church? This is a huge topic, and so I'm only going to offer a few brief thoughts on our own context, which is the Church of England, and you may like to develop these yourself. If we're going to explore what power the church has, we need to make a difference between the institutional church, which Fiona Gardner describes as the national and diocesan organisation of the Church of England, and that's interpreted in terms of hierarchy, structure and systems, rather than relationships. We need to make a difference between that and the local church. And this is the place, Gardner says, which baptizes, marries, conducts funerals, organises fates, runs schools, rings bells, and looks after roofs. So the institutional church is what holds together the local church. It gives them an identity and a place to belong, and a ways and means of going about things. And yet the local church is where it is worked out on the ground. And local churches often have a healthy amount of autonomy, so they organise and structure their life in contextually relevant ways. When we talk about the power of the church, we might think of bishops and big processions, big buildings, the fact that we are the established church, civic occasions, synods, canon law, or any of the myriad other ways in which the Church of England holds together through an exercise of authority. It might be rarely that we think of the power of the church along the lines of Luke's definition above, that soft definition, the ability to make a difference in the world. And yet this is where the local church has and wields great power, for good or for ill. Bishop Alan Wilson argues that abuse always happens within a local context. And so we might think the church is most powerful as the institution or the hierarchy, but I would argue that we're infinitely more powerful in our local expressions of church. And so we need to hold both things together when we're thinking about the power of the church. And so what might a growing awareness of our power look like, both for the institution and for the local church? Later in his book, come back to the Magnificat now, Sykes wonders whether we should take the Magnificat seriously. He says, why then be bothered with orders, offices and titles? Why not sweep the whole lot into the bin of history, throw the mitres into the Thames, and generally take the Magnificat seriously for a change? I think that's a fair question to ask. Fiona Gardner makes a strong argument that clerical vestments enforce hierarchy, status, and what she calls groupthink within the Church of England that keeps power located among a privileged few and sets the powerful apart from the powerless. I'll let you decide whether you agree with her or not. Sykes is a little more pragmatic, arguing that on the whole, it's preferable to know who has the power to do what. Again, he says, by dressing them in purple and sticking funny hats on their heads, rather than having them slink around anonymously. And those are his words, not mine, but he was a bishop, so he's allowed to talk about pointy hats. But I also want to sit lightly to Sykes's presumption that the bishops are where it's at. I've heard plenty of bishops lament their lack of power, that is, their lack of ability to bring change and make a difference in ways that they would like. And so a bishop, although a bishop in her finery at the rear of a cathedral procession may be a symbol of the power of the institution, I'm not convinced that they're the sole or even the primary locus for where the power of the church works itself out on the ground. And so this brings us back to the local church once more. My own research interests, as Chris said, are around power dynamics within local ministry teams. How do we nurture teams of clergy and lay people who are defined not by hierarchy of position, but by a baptismal mutuality, as the Setting God's People Free report called for? And it's just a reminder there of what Setting God's People Free asked for, that baptismal mutuality. In my own exploration of this, I need to exercise a huge amount of self-awareness and reflexivity. I'm ordained, as you know, but I work primarily with lay people who are training for licensed ministry. So that brings a complex dynamic into play. And I want to hear, as somebody who's ordained, I want to hear carefully the critique of hierarchy within the local church. And one critique, again, is offered by Fiona Gardner, who says, the status of clergy implies that they know more about God and the divine mysteries, as they are allowed to minister the sacraments and so channel the love and the gifts of God. The reverend is the one to be revered. Now, perhaps she's setting up a bit of a straw man argument, but I'm not going to argue with her here. You can argue with her if you like. I'm just offering her as one voice of challenge to those of us who are ordained, one perception of how local hierarchy may manifest in an unhealthy, non-mutual way. I hope where Gardner is right is that our culture of deference is now being challenged by the work that's being done to resource and equip and nurture the work and ministry of the whole people of God. So not just clergy, but and not even just licensed lay people, but all people who are disciples. And one of the recent reports from the Church of England, Kingdom Calling, emphasises again this mutuality in terms of vocation and equipping for ministry that goes beyond what clerical ideas of ministry are. So I hope and pray that we're coming to see the whole of our life and work as ministry, enacted by a diverse people whose identity is not in their status or their position or their role, but in a mutuality that we find as co-inheritors of the kingdom of God, or co-labourers in God's field. So we've looked a little at what the power of the church might look like at both institutional and local levels, and I've emphasised the need to look at both. And now I want to explore a little bit more how power has been abused by the church. I don't think anything I'm saying or researching about this is new, and I'm struck by the long paths walked by our brothers and sisters who have fought for racial justice or for gender equality or justice in the face of abuse within the church for decades and centuries. But I do sense that we're beginning to hear these cries in a new way. We've not been without blemish in our approach to power, and we've sometimes caused harm through carelessness and ignorance, through a desire to control, and sometimes through a deliberate intent to hurt. And I hear cries for justice in 3 areas especially at the moment, although there are many, many more. And these areas are calls for racial equality, calls for gender equality, and calls for justice in the wake of the harm done by the church in acts of abuse and how those allegations were subsequently dealt with. Last month marked a year since the murder of George Floyd. Floyd's murder rocked the world in a wave of fury and pain that seemed to be heard louder than any previous for some reason. At the time, I was studying a module on trauma with the Eastern Mennonite University. Many of my fellow students were Black Americans. Others were dialing in from around the world. Some were Indigenous American people, and there were also some white Brits, white Europeans, and white Americans. And together we lamented and cried as we saw the news unfold night after night. And our study of collective trauma became a lived experience for us as a group. And I saw firsthand the fear and the anger of America's Black community. And I heard their pain in new ways. And I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't heard their pain before that experience in that way. Here in the UK, Floyd's death was followed by protests that metaphorically crossed the church door. We were compelled as the established church to look afresh on our own complicity in racism and injustice. Despite voices calling out for this justice for decades, for some reason it was last year that we heard just a little deeper, just a little more. Critical race theory is a controversial topic, and I don't want to get sidetracked by it this evening, except to say that there is a growing movement of theologians within the UK who are taking the challenges of critical race theory seriously. Critical white theology is an area of study that challenges us as the white British Church to look again at our history, to ask difficult questions about how our wielding of power has disempowered whole communities and people, to grow in awareness of how the damage of colonialism seeps even now into our practice and worship and mission. And so I'm not so interested in the controversy of this area and whether we should be talking about it or not. I'm more interested in hearing these voices of anger and lament, these voices who've been silenced for too long as they've tried to challenge power. Another group of people whose voices are silenced by power are women. Not all women, of course. We rejoice that we now consecrate women as bishops in the Church of England. And yet we live in a society which is still deeply patriarchal. This came to the fore last year as the burden of juggling work and caring responsibilities fell disproportionately on women through the pandemic. I saw this within my own community, within my own friends, but this isn't just anecdotal. In November of last year, the United Nations reported that 4 times as many women as men fell out of the US workforce. Across the world, up to 10 times as many women as men took on unpaid responsibilities. The BBC reported on how it was women who commonly found themselves sharing workspaces with children, juggling home learning, household chores, caring responsibilities, and paid employment. The emotional and physical toll of this on women is still to be realised. Within the church, while women may have parity, we still face discrimination on grounds of gender. Women in positions of leadership often find they have to conform to male ways of leading and ministering. My UK minority ethnic colleagues might say the same about white ways of leading and ministering. So beyond and within the church, we are still shaped by patriarchal white power structures and power imbalances that feel immovable, unwieldy, and cumbersome. And of course, in recent years, we've been rocked by the abuse scandals within the Church of England. We've heard horrifying accounts of abuse, and yet there are thousands more untold of bullying, spiritual abuse, and people caught in systems and relationships within the church that do not allow them to be fully who God is calling them to be. Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys have written extensively on healthy Christian culture and on the harm done by spiritual abuse. And they are clear that all of us are vulnerable, both to abuses of power, but also to perpetrating the abuse of power. There isn't scope here to mention the ways in which those within the church can abuse power to harm people of a different class, a different education background, a different sexuality or health status. But I've put some of those things on that list. And what I think all these cries for justice have in common is that they are calling us to consider again how we use and abuse power, both as the institution and as the local church. And indeed, even on the smallest of scales, as disciples in our everyday one-to-one interactions. In all these areas and more, there is call for radical change in how Christian communities hold, mediate, and work with and around power. So we started with this working definition of power as the ability to change the world around us. And so there has to be hope as well as harm found in the power of the church. How might we use power for good, particularly within the local church? I think we need to spend some time hearing these voices of lament and anger, spoken by people who've been harmed by an abuse of power. And I think we need to take them seriously. And to take them seriously means that we're led into a season of repentant reflection on our abuses of power as individuals, as the local church, and as the institution. And this has to be a reflection that leads to meaningful, substantial, and lasting change. But it's a reflection that may also lead to a disempowerment of the powerful. My training on trauma suggests a three-stage approach to healing in which those who suffer from trauma go through 3 stages on their way to healing. Don't worry if you can't see the small writing on this, you don't need to, but if you just get the overall shape of the spiral. So firstly, people need to find safety. That's the bottom of the spiral where it says breaking free. And then next, there needs to be a period of acknowledgement of what has happened, reflecting on events, and moving forward to the 3rd stage, which is where somebody can integrate their experience and find justice and reconciliation. And I wonder whether this same threefold approach might work for us as the local church and as the institution, as we try and work healthily with power. So first, we need to create safety for people. This probably means that those who hold power need to work out how to give their power away to those who don't. This doesn't mean that I hand over my dog collar when I'm wearing it, as powerful an act as that would be, but it does mean that I allow my work and ministry to be shaped, shared, and challenged by those I work alongside. Which voices do I need to hear? And not just hear, but be changed by. My colleague Liz Shercliffe argues that it's not enough to give somebody a voice if we don't really hear what they're saying. Kate Bruce talks about deep listening as a sacrament, a means of sharing the grace of God. And so a healthy approach to power begins in listening, noticing, attending to what's going on, and then doing something about what we hear and what we notice, so that we can create places of safety and sanctuary within Christian communities. And this might, or actually it should, lead to those of us with power going to a place of powerlessness. And that is deeply, deeply challenging. And the moment that a conversation comes anywhere near that suggestion, you see the conversation shut down by those who are powerful. Secondly, we need to name and acknowledge our past and current failings. Azariah Franz Williams, in his book Ghost Ship, talks about the importance of this with regard to racial justice. He says, by minimizing the ongoing oppression for them and failing to name and delineate the privileged us, both the oppressor and the oppressed are rendered invisible. So he's saying, until we can share honestly and openly about this, then we will always dehumanize one another. We remain as them and us. Thirdly, we need to find a way to integrate our learning and build something new, something hope-filled and life-giving that makes the best use of the ability that we have to make a difference for the better. Willie James Jennings, in his essay, After Whiteness, speaks of building together from the ground up, using the fragments of people's faith and life and experience. This is challenging work. It will go against the grain because we have to find new ways of relating to one another and working together. It takes time to have the conversations, to do the deeper spiritual work that form the solid foundations of this work of building. And yet perhaps that deeper work is precisely where God is calling us to be in this season. It's not glamorous and it won't lead to instant results. It may be that we have to tear down what we've built and start again. But the small determined work of pulling together to create something new where everybody has a part is where I think the power of God is to be found. So I'm coming to the end. Where have we found ourselves? A final thought here comes from Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys. The ways in which we cultivate organisational culture and utilise power and authority are key indicators of our character and whether we are focused on ourselves as leaders or on our people as partners and followers. And that's in their book that talks about creating healthy Christian culture. So I think they would define a leader in this context as anybody who's contributing to building healthy Christian culture, which I hope is everybody here. I've put on the slides a bibliography that might be helpful, but that's in the chat for you. If anybody came after I put that in the chat, then I can put it in again. I've tried to take us on a journey through some of my thinking around power, but as I said at the start, I don't want to have the final word on this. So there might be things that you want to pick up on, that you want to disagree with or want to talk more about. And there's some questions here that we may like to think about. So I'll just give you a minute to look at those and then I'll stop sharing the screen and I'll hand back to Chris to chair a conversation. If you've not got them all, they are on the notes.
Thank you, Jenny. You built it up and built it up. The first bit we could just relax about and go, oh yeah. And then the challenges followed. So thank you very much for that. Very interesting because you started to talk about trauma, which is an area I'm working in at the moment, and so on and so forth. So it's amazing how things come together. But now it's all open to you. to challenge, to ask, to remark. So anyone got anything to say, or are you all stunned and feeling guilty?
Well, there is a question in the chat that I can throw out to start with. So a possible question: Tony Benn always used to ask 5 questions with regard to power. So question 1, what power have you got? Question 2, where did you get it from? Question 3, in whose interests do you use it? Question 4, to whom are you accountable? And question 5, how do we get rid of you? And there's a suggestion that we discuss question 1. Where does the church get this power from?
Elaine, did I see a hand up?
It was only with you. Jenny's clocked what I was what I'd mentioned. It was just I was putting it forward on behalf of somebody else who'd sent it to me. So that's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do have just an observation, if that's possible. In the PCC, we've been looking at power, and particularly in regard to the safeguarding. And I think what intrigues me is 2 quid's worth of plastic round your throat gives what is a huge and often unrealistic expectation of the clergy. And I think that that other people imbue people like me with a power that we don't deserve, ask for, or demand. But there is still the expectation. And there are people who just can't even bring themselves to call me by my first name because they feel I should be called the vicar. But if I was a gynecologist, I wouldn't be called the gynecologist. You know, and it's those kind of things where people have what is an expectation. Now, some people may choose to live up to that, but I've had various curates and various people training over the years, and I do feel that all of a sudden, if you have something which is a perceived status, it is sometimes other people who put that expectation of power on you. I mean, I'm in authority. That's the authority I'm given, but I don't plan to be authoritarian. That's kind of a different thing. So that's something which kind of dawns on me, is the expectation of others, which is placed on us, sometimes with no desire.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can be very seductive to leaders. I think I've heard it said that leadership is about constantly stepping off the pedestal that other people put you on.
Anyone got comment or question?
Well,
John.
I believe in power, and by that I mean the power of God, and it is surely the power and omnipotence of God to which we should be pointing, and it is the power and the omnipotence of God in which we should be living in fear and encouraging others too. I certainly believe in the Magnificat. I praise God every day as he who puts down the mighty and exalts the humble and meek. I believe that we always need to reorder our change and everything else. And of course, we very often in all of our callings feel absolutely powerless. But at this time, especially, let's remember, this time has driven us all to be greater people of prayer. I'm sure we're doing more praying than we used to before. As the Praxis leaflet said a week or 2 ago, every home has become an oratory. And people think of power and powerlessness and all these things, but there is more power wielded from one humble person of prayer in a place of prayer than anything we could dream of. And so our power is power, but it's power chiefly in prayer and in humble service, and power that will lead people to glorify God. That's all I've got to say.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. I just add to what Elaine said, if I may. I was a teacher, and we had a head teacher who told us exactly what we should do, was hot on structures. We had this top-heavy structure, and people hated it. And he decided after a year he was going to go somewhere better, as he told us, in Birmingham. And we were all very pleased. But the next head teacher, who suited me down to the ground, actually said, "You're in charge of your department, you know what goes," and said this to everyone, and people hated it because they'd got used to the fact that someone dictated to them. And though they didn't like being dictated to, they knew where they were and didn't have to take responsibility. And it took a long while for people to realize that they really could take responsibility. And I think Elaine's point's a good one. We thrust onto our clergy a role, and if the previous rector did it this way, then you've got a while before you can turn it around to doing it another way.
I just wondered, is Philip Warner, did you want to ask a question? I saw you put your hand up earlier, Philip.
It was just a comment. I'm in charge of a Freemasons Lodge with a Worshipful Master, and my position is there at the head of the lodge, and I suppose everything stops with me, but it doesn't. I'm doing stuff underneath it, like the officers. And so they're doing their bit to keep me there. So I'm not in power, but I'm head of the power. I don't know if did you get any of that?
Missed a little bit of it at the end there, Philip.
Yeah, well, I think, although I'm in a powerful position, I'm reliant on the people around me to keep me there. I'm not powerful as such, but if I was, I'm not running the lodge. It's the people around me that run the lodge, and it's the same with Christianity and all the things. If it wasn't for the people around them, there'd be no good. If the Archbishop did have a bishop, if the bishop did have a minister, the Archbishop would be nothing. So it depends who's below you, what position you're in.
Benny, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just to add to that, really, Fiona Gardner talks about what she calls the shadow structures of power. And she argues, I don't know what to think about this, she argues that we have the people in the positions and the roles that seem to be powerful, but that actually power lies in the shadow structures behind them, which are the conversations in the back rooms and the emails that nobody else sees. And that's quite a sinister approach to power. I don't think that's quite what you're saying, Philip, but it's another dynamic to be aware of when we ask the question, who really does have the power?
Mal, I think you were next.
Just need to unmute myself. Have I? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Something that I've said for many years in my capacity in my work is that we all need people who have the power. What we don't need are people in positions of power who actually need it. That's in my experience is when havoc is created, and in a way echoes a little bit of what you yourself said, Chris, about your previous head teacher. Obviously he needed that power, whereas the second person coming through had the power and was a wiser person in the sense and could use it. But in my experience, we need people to have the power. It's when that person needs the power that things can fall apart.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mal. Linda, and then Anne, Joyce.
I think possibly one of the issues as well is that power, the idea of having power can be fearful, frightening for some people. And I think sometimes we sort of even can face that in church or in any organisation, having to be involved with teaching, trying to enable sixth form or whatever age to do things, and then I can't do that, I'm not good enough or whatever. The idea of taking on something that is seen to give people a more powerful role. Same as I've done it in scouting, I've seen it in the church, in loads of organisations, even as a chair of governors, you're asking people to take on a committee. I couldn't do that. I'm not clever enough. I've not got it's that idea of what comes with the power that can be frightening, can't be? And it can lead to a sort of apathy, but it can also lead to a sort of helplessness. And it's how we do that. I recently did fruitfulness on the front line, and I think there were some ideas in there for maybe engaging with the people within our church communities, but that still doesn't alter the perception of church for those outside it, and things like that. So I think it's more than the people at the top. It's also, if you like, people who have the power, it's also enabling others and encouraging them and assisting them to take on roles where they get some, what they perceive as power, but maybe it's responsibility. But I think that's an issue as well.
Yeah, and maybe it's even about how we restructure those roles to be a bit more radical. There's a question in the chat which is linked to this, which we can come back to in a minute. But do we need to have power located in one person, or do we need to do a bit more radical thinking about how we work and how we operate? I'll just, while I'm saying this, there's a question or a comment here. It says the last year has challenged the Church of England to let go of some of its power structures, stroke pomp. And we've had to speed up our response because of COVID. Perhaps it's the kickstart we need and not to slip back. And yeah, you know, the last year has probably accelerated movement in the Church of England by about 10 years. And we don't really know what that means at the moment or what that might look like, but there's opportunity there as well.
Anne?
Yeah, I loved the little bit about rebuilding the church from fragments where everybody has a part. We've just done our Foundations for Ministry course, and one of the girls on the course with us, she and I work with children who've got disabilities. And she said, oh, the church is fine. The church accepts anybody as long as they look like them and behave like them. Mm-hmm. And that's where it can be tricky. And I think that's what Jenny was saying. Sometimes we might need to radically rethink, how do we include everybody and what part have they got? Because they might do things differently to us, but actually that could open up whole new doorways for us and whole new worlds.
I think it's Liz I was having a conversation with the other day that and we were saying that Nick Bundock says that when you start including one group of people, actually you find that your church becomes inclusive to a whole other group of people as well. Yeah, so inclusion and disempowering snowballs, disempowering of the powerful snowballs.
Janine?
Yeah, it's just an observation really. I think it's when we discuss power anywhere, we discuss power in the church, it's those that are in power that are discussing power and defining what it is, not just how it's distributed, but actually defining what it is. And it's, so all of us here have got an element of power. We have access to emails, we've got access to IT, we've got the awareness, and we're connected with people within the church because we were aware that this was happening, and we've got the confidence to join on a session like this, and we're all sitting here discussing, defining what power is before we even decide how it's distributed and who should have it and what we do about it. So it's how you even bring people into that conversation about who has power. Because I could go out in the street here and speak to loads of people who would tell me a vicar's got no power whatsoever. What are you? There's people all over the country that don't believe the church has got a place at all in our society and would give it no power. It's very much interactional. It is about who gives somebody power, and it's about and who gives us power. The people that give people in the Church of England power are often not even in these conversations. They're not here. They're the people out on the housing estates, the people with disabilities, the people that feel marginalised. Sorry, it's just a bit of an observation. But it's often that the discussions about this happen amongst educated people in universities and in powerful positions in organisations, and it never even leaves those rooms.
Yeah, and even when minority voices find a voice, it's the powerful minorities who find them. Al Barrett and Ruth Harley have written Being Interrupted. That's not on the bibliography, but that's quite good on this, I think. I haven't read it completely, but I need to read it by Monday because I've got a book group on it. So Al Barrett and his church community have developed what they call critical receptivity, which is trying to hear the voices and use the gifts of a whole community and he's in a very deprived community. But yeah, really important.
Church Action on Poverty lays great store in helping people to become spokespeople for their impoverished communities and for their deprivation and their difficulties, which I think is very powerful.
I think there's something about that language, though, just listening to you there, and we all do it. There's something about that language when we talk about power, that it is us, and I do it, and I've probably just done it, saying that we must listen to those in poverty, to those that are in deprivation, to those, and we speak that over them when we talk about those groups of people. And there are actually groups of people that have got a huge amount of power, as it were. So, you know, you look at the Black Lives Movement, you look at some of the protests that you get, that can harness people together around a cause, but don't seem to be able to get that on the table at the meetings that matter.
Thanks.
They're just not included in those debates.
Elaine, followed by, I was going to say, she's smiling, so she knows. It says Andrew O'Brien there, but Elaine first.
Thank you. I mean, I was very taken with what Anna's just said in terms of about inclusivity. And I remember speaking to a fellow colleague, and his endeavour was that there was to have an inclusive church. And we almost say church as if it's one chunk of people or one chunk of like-minded people, because equally well, those who feel they might not have any power, have the power to be unpleasant. They have the power to hiss at small children who make a noise in church, or for those who may have additional learning needs, you know, because they don't behave in the way that they expected when they gave their child an apple and they sat for an hour, you know, in studied silence. And it's quite interesting to think it's not necessarily the church. I suppose it's defining what the church is it the church building, as you said that earlier on, or the wider church. But actually each individual is the church, and each individual has a responsibility to be inclusive, or to be welcoming, or to be, you know, a proclaimer of Jesus Christ. But I think the power has to be owned, to recognise we have the power. That's part of why I did it with the PCC, to actually say, you know, we all have some aspect of power, as Janine's alluded to earlier on. But for those of us who may strive to have a certain type of church, you know, a certain ethos, it requires the investment of everybody on a very equal level, not being told to be welcoming, but actually learning how to be welcoming, or how to be inclusive, or whatever it might be. Because I think that kind of evening out could be, you know, not just reliant on a church leader, but actually on those who feel quite spiteful sometimes to those who don't fit the bill. So,
Andrew, who is really
is Wendy.
You, Wendy.
So hello all, yeah, Wendy O'Brien. I think also what we are discussing here also is a culture, that we have a culture out in society that lets people, or gives people, automatic power, whether that be in the priesthood or in your job. And I'm a funeral home manager. Now, I hopefully actively endorse for my staff and my team accountability and responsibility, and to help them empower the decisions that they make, that they don't have to come to me as their manager to make a good decision, that I let them lead and give them the empowerment to do that. Where you're talking regarding, obviously, ministry, yes, I think it is a cultural thing that we do absolutely give respect to people of a hierarchy, if you want to use that word. And I think it's a cultural thing that if you're going to see the minister for a funeral, the family would automatically give that person respect without actually getting to know that person. So really what I'm trying to say is, to give anybody power, it's about getting to know them as an individual and to see whether they're worthy of that power. And that can be across anything in the world. But it's a cultural society that give that person that autonomy to have that power without getting really to know who they are as an individual. So just my take.
Thank you, Wendy.
And we hold power in different ways, you know. So we might have power because of our role. We might have power because of our personality. I think this is the work of French and Raven. We might have power because of how we interact. So we might be particularly charismatic. So it's all sorts of ways in which we hold and exercise power.
Mal.
Yes, something that came up for me when listening to Elaine, listening to Linda, is if we think of us on the ground, if you like, the parishioners sitting in the church, I think what happens is many who remain silent when they want to speak out, what they're actually doing is colluding with the abuse of power. So if we don't speak up, the person, if you like, who's talking about so-and-so or speaking ill of someone, if you don't speak up, that person assumes you agree with them. And I can understand that many people don't stand up and say, actually, I don't believe in what you're speaking or what you're doing because of fear, but it is a form of collusion. And as I say, backing up that abuse of power. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that the LLF material is trying to address. In their pastoral principles, they name that silence, that oppressive silence, actually as something that is not acceptable and something that we as church communities need to be aware of and need to mitigate against. So yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, good.
I've got a comment in the chat. As there's no hands up, I'll just read that. It says, there's a scene in the dramatisation of Chernobyl in which the KGB is described as a circle of accountability. My experience of the church is similar. The structure is circular. We account to and for one another, but that misses the point of church. As a community, we're all accountable to one another, but we ought to be accountable to God. I'm not sure the C of E reflects my vision of that. And that some of the criticism of how the church has handled various abuse scandals is that we tried to deal with it ourselves and we ended up making a huge mess of it and re-abusing survivors. And I think that comment's probably getting at a similar thing. So how do we know when it's time to bring in power from outside us, from beyond us, to help us work through these complexities of power?
Linda.
I've been doing 10-minute reflections since lockdown started for church, and I've done one tonight on the simpler, humbler, bolder thing. And one of the things that I actually said was, and it's just on me, it sort of fits here, is how we as church have often sort of turned around to our communities and said, right, well, this is what we think you need, and this is what we're going to do for you. And I think lockdown has really taught us that we need to actually be engaging with our communities on a way of trying to draw on people and state, we have got it wrong before. Yeah, we've told you what you need, but we need to find a way. It's that listening, but that active listening, isn't it? And actually hearing. But it's how we do that and engage with people and get them to trust us and believe that we've got new space at the back of our church, and we're trying to say to people, we'd love you to use it, but they're frightened that they're going to walk through the door and get a Bible bashed over their heads. And that's not what we want to do. We want to share our space and practically share God's love without necessarily doing that. So alongside praise and play, we could also have another session that is just for all these poor mums who've had babies this year, or parents or whatever, who just want to come together and talk without God sort of being part of it. But we can be there providing the tea and coffee. Surely that is the sort of thing we should be doing. And that in a way is empowering a community. But it's how we let people see that, because they are suspicious that we just want them. They know numbers are shrinking, and there's a sort of bit of a suspicion that maybe we just want the money or something like that. But it's empowering people to tell us what they want and trusting us to do what they want, not turning it into something that we want, whether that be bums on seats or more people on a Sunday morning. It's that seems a very practical but very small conflict in this sort of balance of power at the moment. I hope I'm not making it sound too trite and small, but I think that's a real sort of issue, this sort of conflict that we've got going between what we think people want and then what they really need. And that's part of power as well, isn't it?
And you've touched on something there that John said before, when you said without God, and I know exactly what you mean by that. And John talked about the power of God. And I wonder whether we think of the power of God as being something very glorious and magisterial, but actually to look at the power of God, we need to look at Christ on the cross as well. And so, and you quoted the Archbishop, simpler, humbler, bolder. Actually, our exercise of power can be a very humble exercise in making space for the power of God that actually on the surface might look like we're doing something without God, if that makes sense.
I do my best reader ministry in the pub.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to be said for that. I don't just mean the pub, obviously. I don't just live in the pub, but that's in the community. And I think that there's a lot to be said. Elaine's laughing there. She knows me too well. But I think there's something to be said for that. But I agree with what Elaine said. It's very difficult for somebody like Elaine to go into the pub when everybody in the pub knows she's the vicar.
Yeah.
Whereas they know I'm a reader and connected with the church, but it's easier because I haven't got that dog collar and that expectation or whatever it is to do that. And I think, again, it's this community thing and all having different ministerial roles, isn't it?
Thank you, Linda. There is Graham Joyce.
Thank you. Yeah, I should say that any resemblance between me and tonight's speaker is purely hereditary. I don't think she'll be calling me vicar. I wanted to ask about the church's applications of rules that are made up by people outside of the local church. We do ourselves no favour in the eyes of people or local press or even the Daily Mail when we offend people by imposing regulations surrounding churchyards and funerals and weddings. We're stuck with the rules, but how can we soften the blow?
I'm shortly stepping out of parish ministry, so I've given up keeping up. But I think there is a review of churchyard rules going on at the moment. Somebody else might know more than me. But yeah, I think that's a tension that we live with, those of us in parish ministry, and we do our best to apply the rules generously and gently. There's a comment in the chat. I liked Jenny's first quote about power being able to make a difference. This ties in for me with God walking alongside us and not imposing from above. I like that.
There is a move outside of the church in commerce and business and industry for servant leadership. And I've always found that ironic that it's outside the church. And it didn't actually start with Christianity. You might have thought someone was inspired because you can see where that might come from with Jesus. But I think it would be good if those who were ordained or had any role in church did a little study of servant leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I'm chuckling a little bit because there's so much been done on servant leadership, like you say, within the business world. And I worry within the church that we hear servant leadership and we think we know what we mean by it.
Yes.
And we tick the box and we move on. We haven't actually started with it.
We've got the chief servant leader on our books.
And what do we really mean by servant leadership? And when we unpack that, you know, Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Wendy. Other Wendy.
I'm just wondering whether Christ calls us to give away power by listening rather than telling.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, I think so.
Have you anything to add, Jenny, to that?
No, I think that's brilliant. It goes right back to Kate Bruce. You know,
Yeah.
Listening is a sacrament. It's not something we do to gain a right to speak. We listen to share the grace of God.
I think Linda touched on it by listening to the people that come into the church, at the back of church, as to how they want to use the space, and about listening rather than telling them what we can provide for them.
Yeah.
Flo. Not yet.
Sorry,
yes.
pressing the wrong button too many times. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to go to, I don't know, I suppose it's a slightly bit of a deeper level on the back of the listening stuff. I recently have had some issues in my parish, and as a result of speaking up about it, I'm living through a really difficult situation with people ignoring me in the streets, not wanting to talk to me, blah, blah, blah. And it's all been brushed under the carpet, it's all been silenced, even though the matter's been dealt with. And I am, you know, the main reason I'm here tonight is because I have such a passion that we need to, at a local church level, start listening to the problems and the mistakes we've made and start recognising them and start owning them. And I think it's great to hear that Elaine's talked about having done some of that stuff with PCC, because I don't think unless what we've done wrong at a local level is observed that we're ever going to make those changes.
Yeah, thank you, Flo.
Thank you, Flo.
And that, I think, yeah, that's, I talk about reflexivity as doing the work within ourselves, but that's equally applicable to us collectively. It's so easy to think that it's somebody else's problem and that it doesn't happen in our own community, and it does.
Wendy, have you got your hand up again? Oh, I think Mal has then.
Yeah, I just want to say how much I admire Flo for what she shared then. And I'd like to applaud her enormously, because for me, it's about, if you like, the little people or whatever, speaking out and doing what's, you know, what's truthful and what's right. And it reminded me of, I worked with a teacher who blew the whistle on, and she was ostracized by all her colleagues. And that was purely what they didn't have the courage to do. And they couldn't look into themselves and think, yeah, that's something I was meant to do. And she had a terrible time over it because she was the one who spoke out. And as I say, her colleagues just sent her to Coventry and she had a hard time. So I applaud you, Flo.
Thank you, Mal. Yes, we've seen that with the, haven't we, with all those post office people speaking up, saying we're not guilty of defrauding the post office, and not being believed, not being listened to for 9 years. And it happens at a national level, that sort of thing, where people are speaking up and those in power are ignoring. It's got to be something else that's caused it, or we're right, or whatever excuse is given. Does anyone else have a thought or comment or question? Anne, and then Linda.
Just following on from Flo, it's a really lonely journey when you're the one who's spoken up and you're the one who's struggling with your church family. And I know one of the books that Jenny advised that I read was about spiritual abuse, and she'll give you the title and I've forgotten it, but I found that so healing and so helpful. And it really reflects what Mal was saying before. Those who are being quiet are actually colluding, and it's so good to be brave and carry on. And it's not the whole of God's family. It's just a tricky time, but we know how that feels.
The book is Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphrey's Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, which is on the bibliography.
Linda.
When we went through something similar with our church float, that God spoke to me quite strongly once in church. I went and prayed, and I shared this with Jenny privately earlier, actually, but I'm going to share it properly now. That I went into church to pray purely because I felt the situation had got so out of hand. I went in on my own, and God said very clearly to me, you must be broken before you can be built up. And I think this is something to be done with where we are as a society at the moment, where we are in terms of power. And if we are going to be built up, we are going to have to allow some sort of brokenness, whether that's brokenness of structures, whether that's brokenness of self and coming down to really analyze and take things on board. But even if you feel broken, God will build you up, and he will build up and keep his church going, because God loves his church. It's the people that make it difficult. You know, and I think that's the important thing to hold on to.
Thank you, Linda.
I quoted Willie James Jennings before, but he has a whole chapter in his essay on this, and he talks about us as creatures of the Creator, and like the Creator, we want to create, we want to build, but so often we build in the wrong direction. And then comes the painful work of breaking down and starting again. So just a different metaphor, or somebody else using the same metaphor. And that's as individuals, but also as communities. And it's no less painful when it's a community, maybe even more painful.
Any more comment or question? Elaine.
May I just say something? I think, I was a nurse before I did all of this. And as a nurse, there were procedures, as Jenny was speaking before, and others, about accountability, about responsibility. And there were structures in place. And I think, certainly as I've been ordained for quite a while now, is that that was a real kind of culture shock, because there weren't the structures to report things, that things were just almost, like the blue touch paper and get on with it. And it's only been in recent times where, probably because of some of the incidences that have happened, some of the stuff to do with safeguarding in particular, that people now are wanting to put things in place. But there is still, aspects of work within church where you don't have the structures. If you, for those who are courageous enough to be whistleblowers, for those who are going to share something which is a suspicion about abuse, for those who just feel that they won't be taken seriously. And whilst now the church is dancing around like a cat on hot bricks, it's now trying to put all these structures in. But for some people, this has been too little too late, because they have been damaged by the way things have just been let be. I just even remember like safeguarding training. I went to the same safeguarding training session as my husband. I went one week and he went another, and it was like a completely different thing, like somebody made it up. It was, there was no consistency like there is now. And so, whilst we don't necessarily as a church want to become business-like, or like a business maybe, there is an aspect of needing to be business-like where we do need those edges and those structures to give people something to hang on to somebody that people can crawl up the ladder or wherever they might need to get to seek help from people, that there are avenues and directions which are very specific and very obvious to people, because we can be powerless because we simply don't know who to speak to. We don't know who we can trust. We don't know who's you know, going to make life miserable for us if we have the guts to say anything about it. So I think, you know, as the church is, you know, evolving, modernizing, wherever you want to be, that there is some aspects which are useful now, which hadn't been in the past. But what we can do about the damage in the past is something, well, you know, the trauma's there, isn't it? How people can actually get themselves out the hole that they feel that they're in. We need those avenues to enable people to find a way out, or wherever it might be.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa Oakley, who I quoted before, she's a professor of psychology at the University of Chester, and she chairs the Church of England's Task and Finish group on spiritual abuse. And I'm hoping they've got something due out shortly. I'm hoping that it will address some of this stuff around culture and protection for people, to have that freedom.
Well, it was her who went, because I went to her presentation. It was incredible, and it was and that's really what enthused me to start talking to the PCC about it, because people don't realise how much power they carry, simply because they might even have the IT facilities to contact people or complain or whatever it might be. Just things which we would take for granted. It might not be anything dramatic. So if anybody does get the chance to listen to her, she is utterly superb. She really is.
Any other thoughts or observations? What has struck me is a bit strange perhaps, but in my lifetime, the church has actually gone from men having a living. Yeah, the parish was a living. And the younger sons of barons and things like that went into the church to get a living. And I caught the tail end of that in my childhood. There was a vicar every 2.5 miles in my rural area. You won't get that now. Yeah. And it was a hobby. So was the hobby they had, you know, collecting porcelain or rearing chickens or something. But it was a living. And they were autonomous. And they had a glebe field. Yeah. And they had this and that. And we've moved in my lifetime. And I'm not saying it was good. What I'm saying is it takes a long time for something like the Church of England to move from that. And there are vestiges of that still around. And yet the important things that Jenny has talked about and you've all talked about are only just really coming onto the agenda. Janine, I see your hand is up.
Yes, sorry, it was just a comment. Chris, you mentioned servant leadership. I did do some research as part of a master's thesis for about 3 or 4 years ago about looking at servant leadership in the NHS and whether it was possible to lead as a Christian in the NHS. And it was quite fascinating. I spoke to a number of senior Christians in leadership positions in the NHS about how they led. And just a couple of things came across. First of all, they were very clear about what the difference was between power in the one hand and responsibility and accountability on the other. So those that could be very clear that they had a huge amount of responsibility and accountability, but that didn't necessarily mean they had and held power. And there were a number of people I spoke to who were quite keen and in some ways quite successful at giving power away. But in order to give power away, you have to have power in the first place. And that's quite an individual thing, as well as having structures in place. It's quite a personal thing. And I spoke to some of those leaders and they could reflect quite deeply and personally about what power meant for them. But I just wonder as well, talking about culture on that, is we spend an awful lot of time, I don't know, I've not been in the Church of England that long, but I did work around social policy and social welfare environments for many years. And there was an awful lot of talk about empowering people. That was what we needed to do. And no talk about disempowering those that had got too much power. And you can keep trying to empower people, but that in itself is disempowering, because it's those that are in power that just keep saying, let's say to those that are disempowered, let's have a quick focus group. Let's, you know, and it's tokenism. It really is in some areas, it's tokenism. And maybe we do need to look at disempowering those in power instead of trying to focus solely on empowering those who we perceive as not having power.
Thanks, Janine. I like that idea of keeping power while you still say we've got to help the disempowered to take some power. It's top down, isn't it? It's a bit like government saying we've got to give some power to the northeast and red wall areas, but actually we're keeping it in London, really.
I think that brings us back really nicely to the Magnificat, you know, which is probably a nice note to finish on. Cast down the mighty. It's there has to be disempowerment as well as empowerment. There just has to be, and that's really uncomfortable and really challenging, but it's there in the Magnificat.
Oh dear. Oh, you brought us back to that bloke. And Mary, and yes, thank you so much. Unless anyone's got anything, you've still got a hand up, Janine. Does that mean you've got a comment? No, it just means, like me, you forget to push buttons. Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you so much, everyone who has contributed, and that's all of you. I haven't a hope of summarizing. I've written some interesting things down for my own use and thinking, oh, that's good. I love that. But I do think racial equality, gender equality, and dealing with abuse, they're three very powerful areas for us to pick up. And I'm not sure we've really got ourselves going on those. So thank you once again for an excellent session, everyone, and particularly Jenny. And I'll say the grace, and I can't hear you unless you unmute, but I'll try and remember all the words when I'm saying it on my own. So shall we say the grace together? The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen.
Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing that for us, and for Jenny for all that she shared with us. Can I just say that next week, if you would like to join us, we're going to be looking at the church and life, and that's going to be led by Christopher Burkitt, which we're very much looking forward to as well. But I just want to say thank you for your company and for everyone who's contributed. I've really, really appreciated that. So thank you.
Thank you. And I don't